I will call the subcommittee back to order. Thank everyone for their indulgence a couple minutes over. Once again, appreciate your patience in accommodating the subcommittee. We have at least one more member who wanted to ask questions, and we want to give everyone time to ask those questions. In the meantime, one of the questions that I would pose as we wait for the other members is looking at the effective penalties relating to marijuana that lead to an increased rate of drug driving. It's my understanding we don't really have a standard, and this is something I'm going to look at nationally to determine the level of narcotic in the bloodstream. And I think also that that marijuana can be detected in the bloodstream for some time after its use. But the whole question of driving impaired is raised. Do you see any, this is to Chief Newsom, do you see any problem with increased use of marijuana, again with the lowering of the penalties and also the inability to come up with a test that would indicate the level of intoxication by marijuana?
Yeah, I don't think, I guess we're going to assume that there's going to be an increase in use based on the decriminalization. I guess there's not going to be any change in the way that we currently enforce people who are driving under the influence of either alcohol or...
But we don't have a test that is administered, and we have no standard nationally or within the district for the amount of marijuana that's tolerated, do we?
No, the way that a driver would be tested on the scene for law enforcement purposes, they would be given a road test as to their ability to perform certain functions. And if they're unable to perform those functions, there's going to be an assumption they're impaired. And then
you do blood tests, though, too?
We can do blood tests if necessary.
Okay. Well, that's another question probably for another hearing, because we see that issue across the United States as far as enforcement. Let me yield now, if I may, to Dr. Fleming.
Well, once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome our panel here today. First of all, it seems in listening to your testimony today, the justification for decriminalizing marijuana is made on the basis of racial disparity. That's the only real argument I heard. So I'd like to ask our two police professionals here today, can you give me just a rough estimate of the white versus non-white numbers among your officers in the field, the ones who would actually make arrests? Both of you, if you could have any, just a range would be fine.
I'm not sure how many.
Your police officers who are in the field who would be the ones making arrests?
About 60% of the Metropolitan Police Department is African American.
Okay, so the majority of the officers making the arrest are African American?
In the District of Columbia.
In the District of Columbia.
For our department, yes.
Right, Mr. McLean, how about you?
And sir, I don't have an approximate number on the breakdown by race.
Okay. You'd say it was evenly balanced, perhaps? That there's certainly, you're well represented by both African American and white police officers?
Correct. We have geographic responsibility in D.C., New York City, and in San Francisco, and we have a very diverse workforce.
Okay. So one would, if you accept these numbers of 1-to-4 or 1-to-8 ratios, I don't doubt those as overall numbers, but the implication one infers from that, Ms. Sadanandam, is that the police officers are actually racially biased. So how do you explain that in the case of D.C., you have a majority of officers who are actually African American? Certainly you don't think that they're racially biased against their own race.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that what we're really seeing is the phenomenon of community-based profiling, that certain communities are treated and policed in a certain kind of way, and those same strategies and tactics aren't necessarily applied in other communities. And with regards to drug law enforcement, I can give you a specific example. One of the reports that we heard from across African-American communities had to do with drug interdiction units, otherwise known as the jump-out car. The police officers riding up on pedestrians and jumping out to stop and search them, in which people consented to searches, which sometimes revealed small amounts of marijuana.
But you would concede that it's not a racial bias, that this is not, because again, you've got the same African-American officers who are actually arresting African-Americans. It sounds like what you're saying is that certain communities have a higher density of police officers or police enforcement.
No, I wouldn't concede that it's not a racial bias. I don't think that the race of the police officer necessarily determines whether or not there's an institutional bias in which communities on the basis of race are policed. I don't think that just because a police officer is black, that police officer doesn't carry implicit bias that is carried throughout our society, across all races, due to a number of different factors, which we don't have to get into here today.
Okay, well, let me shift a little bit here. So what about other crimes, grand theft auto, murder? Do you think that we should reduce enforcement or penalties because there are also found to be racial disparities there? Would you would also recommend that we reduce or perhaps even not sentence someone who's committed murder to prison simply because there's a potential racial bias?
I think that what we can say with certainty about marijuana is that the criminalization of marijuana has not had an impact on either use or availability.
That's an answer to a different question. My question is, what about other crimes? Would you diminish those sentences and enforcement based on racial disparity?
I think we definitely need to look at whether or not our criminal justice approach to public safety issues is in fact making us safer. And when we measure the efficacy of those approaches, we need to look at more than just how many people we arrest. We need to look at whether or not communities—
But just yes or no, do you think we should diminish enforcement and penalties for those other crimes that are far more serious that may have racial disparities?
Well, I think that if there are racial disparities and the approach to criminal justice is found not to be effective, then we should seriously consider examining the types of sentences and approaches that we take to dealing with those public safety issues.
Okay, so I take that as sort of a yes. Well, again, back to our police officers. Do you agree that perhaps there is some racial bias or bigotry, perhaps, that leads to these rates of arrest that seem to be disparate?
I mean, I would hope that people wouldn't draw that conclusion based on an analysis that's just based on race alone. I think you have to look at other factors that may be causing that. And I brought up one of the factors that we've considered, which are calls for service, where the community calls the police to a particular area. So if there's more police in the area, there's likely to be more arrests. So I think that it's definitely an issue that needs to be looked at. I think it needs to be looked at carefully. I've worked on the Metropolitan Police Department for almost 25 years. The folks that I work with in that agency would obviously be very upset to hear that they're being accused of a biased enforcement, and that's one of the things that we work very hard to prevent.
Sure. And again, to reiterate a statement you've made twice, you're saying that you're not affirmatively going into communities seeking out criminals. You're getting calls. You're getting a higher density, a higher frequency of calls, and obviously your officers are responding to those calls and certainly responding and reacting to the laws that are in force.
That's one of the factors I think that needs to be looked at.
Right. One thing that I might also suggest in this is a drug counselor told me back in the 80s that if you see a pure alcoholic, take a picture because that's probably the last one you will see. Now, what he meant by that was that nowadays when it comes to chemical addiction, it's a polypharmacy issue. that you rarely see someone use just marijuana if they have an addiction problem. I'm not suggesting everyone who uses marijuana uses other drugs. What I'm saying is that those who do use drugs frequently, those who are addicted to drugs, oftentimes use many different drugs. And so it certainly would seem to me, and I'd love to get your response to this, that while you may find marijuana on the person of that individual, that person could have been using other drugs to which it could have created a behavior that generated that call to service.
I mean, I think I would respond like this, is that, you know, we on the Metropolitan Police Department, we enforce the laws that are in place, the local laws that are in place. And, you know, to suggest that, you know, a person is using one drug or another is really not what we do. We enforce the laws that are in place, and I don't think anyone has said that there isn't going to be a consequence for marijuana possession in the District of Columbia. It's just the consequence has changed. It's changed from a notice of violation for less than an ounce from an arrest situation. So I think the enforcement is still there. I think there's still, at least the laws want there to be enforcement action, and we're going to continue to enforce those laws.
Right. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Norton, did you have additional questions?
Just to clarify, because that was, I think, an informative answer that you gave, Mr. Newsom, this time and before about high crime areas. Let me call them high crime areas. You said we receive a large number of calls. And here's where I want to speak about the consequence of the law. You receive a large number of calls before this law was passed, and marijuana possession is, in fact, against the law. And you have reason to believe a person is in possession of marijuana, then whether you are a black or a white policeman or Hispanic or Asian policeman, you will, in fact, enforce the law because possession of marijuana in the District of Columbia is against the law. Yes, I'm
Yeah,
asking.
I agree. I'm shaking my head. I agree, yes.
Yes. So African-American policemen would not be inclined to give a pass to African-Americans if this is the law of the land, because they enforce the law in the same way that our white officers do. Would that not be the case?
I think that's accurate.
So if the law changes and you get the same number of calls, particularly in areas where there may be more crime than others, and the officer believes that someone may possess marijuana, that same officer, black or white, will act the opposite of how he acts today when marijuana decriminalization, when marijuana possession is against the law.
I think the action will be different. I don't know if it's necessarily
Well, how would he behave today? For example,
he would issue a notice of violation as opposed to making an arrest. So there's still an enforcement action that will be taken.
yes, the person still is subject to a
fine.
A fine. He does not get a record. The council's bill says that the odor of marijuana, the smell of marijuana is not enough. Do you believe, therefore, for mere possession of marijuana, there would be a decrease in the number of people arrested?
There will certainly be a decrease in arrests, but if you're talking about situations where enforcement action is taken,
for mere possession of marijuana.
Right.
In other words, these were people arrested for possession only. Now, I can understand you're being arrested and you're looking for a number of different offenses, but where the officer suspects that the person possesses marijuana only.
Yeah, the arrests most definitely will decrease. Absolutely. Enforcement.
How about
I think enforcement action, whether enforcement action will be taken, it's hard to say.
Yeah, because because there is some enforcement action that is still possible.
It's a civil
For
act.
example, I suspect it would be more likely if the person were smoking openly the marijuana. In that case, I would expect enforcement action to be taken. Is that not the case?
There will be, yes. The smoking marijuana in public, there will still be an arrest.
And I would expect that our African-American police officers would be as likely to arrest for smoking marijuana openly as our white officers or officers of other backgrounds.
I think that's fair to say, yes.
Thank you very much. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank each of our witnesses for appearing today and for their testimony and participation. As we sort through this, some of these issues, we are seeking answers. No decision has been made yet, and whether Congress will contest or overturn or attempt to overturn the district law that's been passed. It is very clearly our responsibility, one under the Constitution, one under the creation of the District Act in 1790, one under the Home Rule Act of 1973 that gave us specifically 60 legislative days to review these laws. And now it may not be that common that this is done, but this particular change in law does, as we have heard, affect again, a number, in fact, 26 federal agencies in the District of Columbia that are charged with the responsibility of law enforcement. There are other factors, and we're trying to sort through the position of the administration, the U.S. Attorney, and others who will help determine policy. We will continue this series in our next hearing. As I said, we will look at some of the other implications as far as changing the status of this particular level of narcotic, which is now a Schedule I narcotic, which has been pointed out again in this hearing. Some of the contradictions between policy as enumerated or possible changes in policy as enumerated by the President, conflicting statements by the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Office of National Drug Policy, ONDCP, the office under the President of the United States. So it's an important issue. It is a change in society's perception of the use and abuse of a narcotic, and we will sort through this in an organized and focused manner, and everyone will have an opportunity to participate. I thank the gentlelady from the district for coming to participate, both as a witness and also from the dais today. Without objection, the record will be left open for 10 days for additional statements or questions that may be posed to the witnesses who are here today. Again, I thank our witnesses, and there being no further business before the subcommittee, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.